My father raised his glass in the lavish wedding hall, telling hundreds of guests I was good for nothing but my wealth. He had no idea what I brought tonight was not my usual patience. It was the evidence needed to collapse the luxury life they built on my back. When I grabbed the microphone to announce the $100,000 gift was canceled, it was not a sudden outburst. It was the trap finally snapping shut. I am Lydia Ward. At 38 years old, my life is meticulously organized, structured into ledgers, risk assessments, and recovery margins. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Harbor Trace Recovery Group, operating out of the steel and glass heart of Grayport. We handle commercial loss recovery and corporate cost auditing. When a massive logistics firm bleeds capital through supply chain friction, or a coastal developer faces catastrophic storm damage, my firm steps in. We dissect the wreckage, trace the missing funds, and force the numbers back into alignment. It is clinical, profitable, and fiercely demanding work. I built this empire with my own hands, forged in the fires of late nights and ruthless negotiations. I live alone in a high-rise penthouse overlooking the gray, churning Atlantic Ocean. My wardrobe is a strictly curated uniform of tailored black and charcoal wool. My routines are unyielding. Out in the corporate world, I am feared and respected as a titan of industry. Inside my family, however, I am simply the invisible machine that prints the money. I shifted my weight on the imported Italian leather sofa, immediately wincing as a sharp, burning ache radiated across my abdomen. It had been exactly 5 days since the emergency gallbladder surgery. The incisions were still raw, angry red marks concealed beneath the soft cashmere of my oversized sweater. The surgeons had instructed me to rest for at least 2 weeks, explicitly warning me against stress, heavy lifting, or sudden movements. But rest is a luxury my family never allows me to afford. The glowing screen of my smartphone illuminated the darkened living room, casting a cold, clinical blue light over the empty space. During my 3 nights in the hospital, the nurses had shown me more genuine compassion than anyone sharing my last name. There were 0 missed calls on my phone asking how my pain levels were today, or if I could manage to keep solid food down yet. Instead, there was a steady, relentless, suffocating stream of notifications demanding capital. My father, Douglas Ward, had sent 4 text messages in the span of 2 hours. Make sure the floral deposit clears by 4 o'clock today. The country club members are expecting a flawless presentation. Lydia. Do not let the family lose face over a missed deadline. Did you confirm the valet service payment? There was no trace of fatherly warmth. No. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Or, take it easy today. We can handle this. Douglas is a man who breathes social currency like oxygen. He spends his days holding court at his exclusive golf club, meticulously projecting the image of a robust, wealthy generational patriarch to his affluent peers. He plays 18 holes, smokes expensive imported cigars, and speaks in grand, booming tones about family legacy and traditional values, all while carefully, deliberately ignoring whose sweat actually pays his exorbitant membership dues. He wears bespoke suits funded by my audits, yet treats me like a mid-level accountant who is perpetually falling behind on her deliverables. Then came the barrage of messages from my younger brother, Grant. Hey, Lydia. The vendor needs the wire code for the custom lighting rigs immediately. Also, Dad said you were handling the final catering balance? Let me know the minute it is done. Grant is the golden child. He is the perpetual creative entrepreneur whose grand endeavors always require just a little more financial runway to take off. His current venture, Lantern Acre Distilling, is an artisanal liquor brand that looks absolutely fantastic on social media feeds but continuously hemorrhages cash in reality. He sells a curated rustic aesthetic, pouring average spirits into beautiful bottles with hand-pressed labels. Everyone in my father's circle praises his vision, his rugged charm, his innovative spirit. No one ever mentions the precarious, crumbling balance sheets I have secretly bailed out more times than I care to count. To them, he is a young titan in the making. To my accounting software, He is a massive liability. And then there is Tessa Vale, Grant's fiancée. She bills herself as a high-end luxury branding expert. She is always impeccably groomed, her hair falling in perfect waves, her voice a soft, practiced purr designed to make wealthy people lean in and trust her. But I have sat across the dinner table from her enough times to recognize the cold, calculating arithmetic in her eyes. When Tessa looks at me, she is not seeing a future sister-in-law or a family member to bond with. She is mentally measuring my net worth, my liquid assets, and plotting how easily she can siphon them into her own accounts. It was Tessa, armed with her soft voice and hard, unyielding ambition, who maneuvered me into becoming the financial cornerstone of this entire wedding spectacle. Months ago, she engineered a dinner conversation where I was outnumbered, exhausted from a massive corporate audit, and ambushed by my father's booming expectations. Before the dessert was even served, I had been pressured into promising a wedding gift of $100,000, ostensibly to give the young, beautiful couple a proper start in their new life together. The wedding is set to take place at Belmere House, a sprawling, historic estate situated on the dramatic cliffs of Ashcroft Harbor. It is the kind of venue that requires a down payment equivalent to a luxury sports car. It features manicured seaside lawns, massive crystal chandeliers, and an aura of old money that my father desperately craves to associate with our family name. They are sparing absolutely no expense, importing out-of-season white blooms and booking top-tier live entertainment, entirely because they believe the expenses are not truly theirs to bear. They are spending my years of corporate warfare on silk napkins and artisan seafood stations. I set the phone down face down, ignoring the phantom buzzing that vibrated against the glass tabletop. The silence of my high-rise apartment felt incredibly heavy, almost oppressive. I pressed a hand gently against my side, feeling the medical tape pull tightly against my skin. The physical pain from the surgical wounds was sharp and grounding, but the emotional clarity I was suddenly experiencing cut much deeper, straight to the bone. For years, I had rationalized their behavior. I told myself that family dynamics are always complicated. I reasoned that Douglas was just a proud man from a different era who struggled to express affection. I convinced myself that Grant just needed a bit more time and support to finally find his footing in the business world. I believed my financial interventions were temporary bridges to their eventual independence. But sitting here in the quiet darkness, watching the screen light up the edges of the room with new invoice numbers and routing requests, the long-held illusion finally shattered into jagged pieces. I picked up the phone again and scrolled backward through the chat history with my father. 3 months of messages, 6 months, an entire year. Not a single, solitary inquiry about my life, my business struggles, or my physical well-being. The entire digital record was nothing but a ledger of dollar amounts, urgent due dates, and heavy-handed social obligations. I opened Grant's text thread. It was identical, just wrapped in casual slang and fake brotherly affection. I realized with a sickening, hollow drop in my stomach that I am not a daughter to Douglas Ward. I am not a sister to Grant Ward. I am an infrastructure. I am the silent, invisible, uncomplaining foundation upon which they have built their grand theatrical lives. They step out onto the brightly lit stage, soaking in the applause and the admiration of high society, wearing the expensive tailored suits and sipping the artisanal cocktails, while I remain hidden in the dark, paying the stagehands, clearing the debts, and keeping the lights from turning off. They expect me to show up at Belmere House this weekend, physically weak from major surgery, smile graciously through the lingering pain, and quietly hand over a check for $100,000 so they can continue playing their fraudulent parts. They assume my wealth is a boundless, magical well, and my compliance is an unshakable, permanent guarantee. They genuinely believe that the woman who built Harbor Trace Recovery Group from the ground up, the woman who ruthlessly dissects corporate fraud and destroys dishonest executives for a living, will simply close her eyes and submit to the emotional extortion happening in her own living room. Another message chimed, vibrating loudly against the glass. Tessa this time. Lydia. Darling, just checking if the string quartet has been finalized and paid? We really need that sophisticated touch for the cocktail hour on the terrace. We are counting on you. I stared down at the screen, my own reflection ghosting over her demanding words. The woman staring back at me looked pale and physically exhausted, but her eyes were flinty, sharp, and terrifyingly cold. The dull throb in my abdomen seemed to pulse in perfect time with a new, dark, rhythmic resolve settling deep into my chest. They wanted a chief executive officer to handle their accounts and underwrite their fantasies. They had no idea they were about to get exactly what they asked for. I locked the phone screen, plunging the room back into total, unforgiving darkness, and for the very first time in my 38 years of life, I stopped trying to find excuses for the people who shared my blood. It was Thursday evening, roughly 48 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The storm outside lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, mirroring the dull, persistent throbbing beneath my ribs. I was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of warm peppermint tea, trying to clear out my corporate inbox before the weekend. Among the heavily encrypted financial reports and legal briefs from my firm, a mundane notification popped up. The sender was Chloe, the senior event coordinator at Belmere House. The subject line read, "Final rehearsal video and slideshow proof." I almost deleted it. I had absolutely no desire to watch a curated montage of my brother and his fiancée pretending to be a self-made power couple. But the meticulous auditor in my brain took over. If my accounts were paying for the audiovisual setup, I needed to verify the deliverable. I clicked the secure link and downloaded the massive file. The video player opened on my laptop screen. For the first 4 minutes, it was exactly what I expected. A sweeping drone shot of the Ashcroft Harbor coastline, followed by a slideshow of Grant and Tessa set to generic, royalty-free acoustic music. There they were, posing in vineyards, laughing on sailboats, holding up glasses of his artisanal whiskey. It was a perfectly packaged illusion of success. The music faded out. The screen faded to black. I reached for the trackpad to close the window, assuming the presentation was over, but my eyes caught the timeline at the bottom of the player. The total runtime was just over 7 minutes. The playhead was only halfway across the bar. I paused, my finger hovering over the mouse. The screen remained pitch black, but a new, distinct sound began to filter through the high-fidelity speakers of my laptop. It was not music. It was the ambient, echoing noise of a large, empty room, the grand ballroom at Belmere House. I heard the unmistakable squeak of a catering cart rolling across polished hardwood, followed by the heavy thud of a door closing. Then, the sharp, familiar sound of a glass bottle clinking against a crystal tumbler. My father's cough echoed off the unseen walls. The audio was raw, unedited, presumably captured by the stationary microphone left on the podium after the official rehearsal had concluded. The videographer must have walked away, leaving the recording software running, and carelessly exported the entire timeline without trimming the dead space. Gah! The floral arrangements looked cheap, my father's voice boomed, distorted slightly by the echo but undeniably his. Did you see the hydrangeas? I told her we needed orchids for the main tables. It is fine, Douglas, Tessa replied. Her tone was completely stripped of the soft, breathless quality she usually employed around me. It was flat, clinical, and sharp. We can dispute the final vendor invoice after Sunday. Right now, we just need to focus on the toast. Then, a deep, rumbling laugh from my father, a laugh that sent a sudden, jagged spike of ice straight into my veins. Just make sure you two play the part, he said, his voice dripping with casual disdain. Only her money is useful. If Lydia shows up, smile at her until the wire clears. I stopped breathing. The pain in my abdomen vanished, entirely eclipsed by a ringing in my ears. I stared at the black screen, paralyzed, as the conversation continued. I have the folder ready, Tessa said smoothly, the rustle of heavy paper audible through the microphone. Right after the champagne toast, while everyone is distracted by the cake cutting, I will pull her aside into the bridal suite. I will tell her it is just a temporary packet of documents, A standard formality to release the final venue holds. I have buried the guarantor signatures on page 4 and page 7. Guarantor signatures. My mind raced, pulling up every financial dictionary I possessed. You do not need a guarantor for a wedding venue. You need a guarantor for debt. Are you sure she's going to sign it without having her lawyers tear it apart first? Grant's voice finally entered the mix. He sounded nervous, not out of guilt, but out of cowardice. Lydia reads everything. She audits multinational corporations for a living. She is recovering from surgery. Grant, Tessa countered sharply. She is exhausted, heavily medicated, and she does not want to ruin your perfect day. Besides, you are the one who said she is a pushover when it comes to the family image. She is, Grant agreed, his voice growing a fraction more confident. If you put her in a position where refusing to sign creates a scene in front of the country club crowd and the investors, she will fold. She always softens when she has to protect the family honor in front of outsiders. Just hand her the pen and look stressed. The silence that followed was thick with complicity. Then, Tessa dropped the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Once she signs, I will scan it straight to the underwriter at Holloway Bridge Capital. With her net worth backing the application, the bridge loan for the distillery will be authorized by Monday morning. The $100,000 gift she promised is already listed as our primary collateral deposit, but the signature secures the rest of the credit line. Holloway Bridge Capital. A premier, aggressive corporate credit fund known for issuing high-interest mezzanine debt. My brother was not just failing at selling whiskey. He was drowning in corporate debt, and they were using my wedding gift, my promised $100,000, as bait to secure a massive loan, and they planned to trick me into becoming the legal guarantor for all of it. The audio clip ended abruptly, cutting off mid-sentence as the recording equipment was presumably powered down. The silence in my apartment rushed back in, deafening and absolute. For 10 full minutes, I did not move a single muscle. I experienced a rapid, violent succession of emotions. First came the profound, breath-stealing shock. Then came the deep, burning humiliation of hearing my own father reduce my entire existence to a bank account. But the final emotion, the one that settled over me like a heavy protective armor, was pure, absolute zero cold. This was not a moment of thoughtlessness. This was not a family leaning on their eldest sibling out of desperation. This was a calculated, premeditated financial ambush. They had weaponized my sense of duty. They were planning to serve me a legally binding noose disguised as a wedding celebration. The woman who had spent years excusing their behavior died in that chair. The chief executive officer of Harbor Trace Recovery Group took the wheel. I reached out and dragged the mouse across the screen. Scrubbing the playhead back to the 5-minute mark, I listened to it again, and then a third time. I memorized the cadence of their voices, the exact phrasing of their deceit. I needed to ensure my mind would never be able to soften the reality of what I had heard. There would be no room for doubt, no space for forgiveness. I opened my terminal application. Working with practiced, methodical precision, I downloaded the raw video file directly from the cloud server. I did not just save the clip. I extracted the exchangeable image file format data, locking down the exact timestamps, the geolocation tags pinpointing Belmere House, and the audio encoding details. I created an immutable digital fingerprint of the recording. I transferred the pristine original file, along with the extracted metadata, onto 2 separate, encrypted solid-state drives. One drive went into the fireproof safe bolted to the concrete floor of my office closet. The other slid into the inner pocket of my leather work bag. I closed the laptop, plunging the room back into the shadows of the storm. I sat in the dark, the faint glow of the city lights reflecting off the wet windows. A normal person would have picked up the phone, called her father, and screamed until her voice gave out. A normal person would have canceled the wire transfers right then and there, burning the wedding to the ground in a fit of righteous rage. But I do not operate on rage. Rage is sloppy. Rage leaves legal loopholes and allows the guilty to play the victim. If I confronted them tonight, they would deny it. They would claim it was a joke taken out of context. They would scramble, hire lawyers, and attempt to salvage the bridge loan through some other fraudulent avenue. No, I would not give them the luxury of preparation. I decided right then, sitting in the total darkness of my living room, that I would not show a single crack in my demeanor. Tomorrow, I would answer Grant's texts. I would confirm the floral deposits. I would let them continue to believe that the trap they had so carefully laid for the tired, dutiful daughter was working perfectly. Let them build their house of cards as high as they possibly could. It would only make the collapse that much more spectacular. The heavy oak door of my apartment chimed at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. I pulled my cashmere wrap tighter over my still tender abdomen and walked slowly to the foyer. When I opened the door, Grant stood in the hallway. He looked like he had just stepped out of a lifestyle magazine spread, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blazer and a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He carried a large iced caramel latte in his right hand and a thick oxblood leather portfolio tucked securely under his left arm. He did not bring a bouquet of flowers. He did not bring a thermos of hot soup. As he strode past me into the living room, bringing the sharp scent of expensive cologne and roasted espresso with him, he did not utter a single question about my surgical incisions, my recovery progress, or my pain management. "Morning, Lydia," he said breezily, taking a long sip of his iced drink. He dropped his tall frame onto my white linen sofa, completely oblivious to my stiff, careful movements as I sat down in the armchair opposite him. "I know you are supposed to be resting, so I will make this fast. The venue coordinator is breathing down my neck about final clearances, and Tessa is stressed out of her mind." He unzipped the leather portfolio and slid a thick stack of heavy bond paper across the glass coffee table toward me. "What exactly is this, Grant?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral. "Just some temporary authorization forms and payment backup agreements," he replied smoothly, though I noticed his eyes darted toward the window rather than meeting mine directly. "It is just to ensure the event organizers, the vendors, and the post-wedding loan schedules all match up with the venue's master timeline. A pure formality. We just need your signature on a few pages so they stop panicking about the final invoices." I picked up the stack of papers. The header on the first page did not belong to Belmere House, the catering company, or any floral vendor. The embossed logo at the top right corner read, "Holloway Bridge Capital." It was a commercial credit agreement. I did not gasp. I did not throw the papers back at him. My professional training took over instantly, slipping me into the cold, methodical rhythm of an auditor dissecting a fraudulent corporate ledger. I flipped past the cover sheet, ignoring the dense paragraphs of standard legal boilerplate, and turned directly to the execution blocks at the back of the packet. There it was. At the bottom of page 14, listed under the bold heading of Primary Guarantor Assurance, was my printed name, and right above it, resting perfectly on the solid black line, was my signature. I stared at the blue ink. To an untrained eye, it was flawless. It possessed the same sharp, aggressive slant I always used. But I sign hundreds of corporate authorizations a year. I know the microscopic anatomy of my own handwriting. The loop of the letter L was slightly too wide, and the tail of the letter A dragged out at a highly specific, abnormal angle. It was an exact, pixel-perfect replica of the signature I had used on a proxy voting form for the family trust exactly 3 years ago. Someone had scanned that old, archived document, digitally isolated my signature, and expertly embedded it into this new contract file before printing it out on high-quality paper. The stroke possessed no natural pen indentation, no subtle variance in ink pressure. It was a high-resolution, meticulously executed counterfeit. I slowly looked up from the page. Grant was taking another sip of his coffee, trying entirely too hard to look casually bored. "Since when did my wedding gift become a collateral guarantee for business capital?" I asked. My tone was flat, completely devoid of an interrogative upward inflection. It was a statement of undeniable fact disguised as a question. Grant choked slightly on his latte. The bored facade vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of genuine, defensive irritation. He set the plastic cup down on the glass table with a sharp clack. Come on, Lydia, he sighed, dragging a hand through his perfectly styled hair. The sweet, brotherly pitch of his voice dropped into something tight and pushy. Do not do this. Do not start dissecting things like you are billing hours at your firm. It is just family procedure. It is a bridge loan to cover the distillery expansion while the wedding funds clear. We are just using the promise of your gift as a placeholder. Do not turn this into some rigid legal issue. Before I could point out that forging a signature on a commercial loan document was the literal textbook definition of a severe legal issue, Grant's phone began to vibrate aggressively on the table. The caller identification displayed our father's name. Grant snatched the device up, answered the call, and immediately put it on speakerphone, setting it back down between us. It was a highly orchestrated, theatrical move. Grant, are you with your sister? Douglas Ward's voice boomed through the small audio speaker, carrying the heavy, authoritarian resonance he usually reserved for intimidating junior partners at his golf club. I am here, Dad, Grant said, looking directly at me with a sudden surge of unearned confidence. I am just showing Lydia the timeline documents, but she is getting stuck on the technicalities. Lydia, my father barked, not bothering with a single word of greeting. Stop acting like a dry, paranoid accountant. Your brother is getting married in 2 days. This is about securing his future and maintaining our standing. We do not have the time or the patience for you to redline every single paragraph. Family is not a place for bargaining. Sign the authorizations. Let the boy get back to his fiancée, and focus on getting yourself presentable for the photographs on Sunday. The line went dead. He ended the call without waiting for a single syllable of my response. Simultaneously, my own mobile phone screen lit up on the side table next to my elbow. 3 rapid-fire text messages from Tessa arrived in quick succession. The first was a high-resolution photograph of a breathtaking white silk wedding gown hanging against a sunlit window. The second was an image of perfectly seared scallops resting on gold-rimmed porcelain catering plates. The third was a shot of towering, extravagant floral centerpieces arranged on a banquet table. Following the images was a single line of text. We are counting on you. Lydia. I sat back against the linen cushions, letting the heavy silence stretch across the living room. I looked at Grant. I looked at the forged signature on the heavy bond paper. I felt the dull, throbbing ache of my surgical wounds flare up again, serving as a bitter physical reminder of my current vulnerability. They were playing a highly coordinated, multi-front psychological game. Douglas provided the heavy artillery and the authoritarian guilt. Tessa provided the emotional manipulation and the aesthetic pressure. Grant was simply the delivery mechanism, the handsome face sent to collect the final prize. If I refused to sign right now, Grant would immediately snatch the folder back. They would destroy the physical evidence of the forged documents and find another, more aggressive way to corner me at the rehearsal dinner. I needed to retain physical possession of this contract. I needed to keep the smoking gun inside my apartment. I let out a long, heavy breath and slumped my shoulders, physically manifesting the utter exhaustion that was supposed to be my fatal weakness. I pressed my palm gently against my side and closed my eyes for a brief moment. I am just deeply tired. Grant, I said softly, injecting a slight, believable tremor into my voice. The pain medication is making my head foggy, and staring at these tiny legal fonts is giving me a migraine. Leave the folder here on the table. I will look over the vendor schedules this afternoon when I have some clarity, and I will bring the signed packet to the rehearsal dinner tomorrow evening. Grant relaxed instantly. The defensive tension drained completely from his shoulders, and a wide, victorious smile spread across his handsome face. He genuinely believed that my physical frailty and my lifelong, conditioned habit of yielding to family pressure had finally won out over my sharp professional instincts. Of course, Lydia, he said, his voice instantly returning to that sickeningly sweet, brotherly tone. Take your time. Rest up. I will tell Tessa not to worry about the clearances. We will see you tomorrow night. He stood up, grabbed his half-empty coffee cup, and walked toward the foyer with a light, confident step. He did not look back. The heavy oak door clicked shut. sealing me alone in the apartment. I sat perfectly still for several minutes, the absolute silence washing over me. I reached out and pulled the oxblood leather portfolio back across the glass table, resting my hands flat against the thick paper. The reality of their grand scheme was now laid bare, printed in sharp black ink. They did not just want my liquid cash to pay for the imported flowers, the crystal chandeliers, and the artisanal catering. That was merely the superficial surface level of their parasitism. They had dug a massive, suffocating crater of corporate debt with Lantern Acre Distilling, and they were actively trying to shove me into the bottom of it. They wanted my pristine credit rating, my protected corporate assets, and my legally binding signature to absorb the catastrophic financial failures they had recklessly created. The upcoming wedding was not a celebration of love or new beginnings. It was an elaborate, glittering stage designed entirely to slip a permanent financial noose around my neck while I was distracted by the classical music and the polite applause. I picked up the forged contract, feeling the coarse texture of the bond paper between my fingertips. I did not feel hurt anymore. I did not feel a sense of familial betrayal. I felt the cold, sharp, exhilarating focus of a chief executive officer methodically preparing for a hostile, scorched-earth corporate takeover. I stared at the flawless, fraudulent ink of my own signature on the commercial loan agreement, and the sharp lines suddenly blurred, transporting me back to another set of financial documents from over a decade ago. It was the same kind of heavy legal paper, carrying the same suffocating weight of ruin, but back then, the disaster was entirely real, and the blood on the ledger belonged to my father. Before Harbor Trace Recovery Group existed, before I lived in a penthouse or wore bespoke charcoal suits, there was Calder Ridge Supply. It was a regional chain of family-owned hardware and home material stores that my grandfather had built from a single storefront into a respectable local enterprise. Douglas inherited a healthy, thriving business and immediately set about destroying it with his insatiable need for expansion and prestige. He wanted to be a titan of regional commerce, so he over-leveraged the company, signing brutal, inflexible commercial leases in 3 adjacent counties right as the market began to violently contract. When the massive corporate big-box stores moved in and the local housing market stalled, Douglas absolutely refused to adapt. He fired his analysts, ignored the red ink bleeding across every quarterly report, and kept ordering premium inventory that simply gathered dust on the shelves. He sat in his mahogany-paneled office, swirling expensive scotch, blaming the economy, the government, and the ungrateful consumer base, entirely blind to his own bloated incompetence. When the massive debt bubble finally burst, the banks moved in with terrifying speed. I was 24 years old at the time, halfway through an incredibly competitive Master of Business Administration program at the Whitley School of Business. I was thriving. I was at the top of my cohort, poised to secure a high-level consulting position at a premier global firm. My entire future was mapped out, bright and unburdened. Then came the frantic, late-night phone call from my mother, crying because the creditors were threatening to seize the family townhouse. Douglas was completely paralyzed, locked in his study, unable to face the public humiliation of bankruptcy. I did not hesitate. I packed my small apartment near the university, withdrew from my graduate program, and walked directly into the smoldering wreckage of my father's failures. I spent 18 hours a day negotiating with ruthless liquidators, fending off aggressive collection agencies, and untangling the disastrous web of toxic commercial leases he had signed. I learned the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of loss recovery in the most painful way possible. I realized I possessed a terrifyingly sharp aptitude for finding hidden capital, restructuring debt, and forcing hostile parties to the bargaining table. Out of that miserable, exhausting ash heap, I slowly built Harbor Trace Recovery Group, taking on the smallest, most difficult corporate salvage jobs no one else wanted, armed with nothing but sheer grit and a desperate need to keep my family from drowning. The most closely guarded secret of my life is how I saved the family home. The sprawling, historic townhouse in the Prime District was weeks away from public foreclosure. Douglas would have genuinely preferred to die rather than let his affluent golf club friends see a bank seizure notice nailed to his front door. So, using the first substantial profits I made from Harbor Trace, I established a blind trust called Calder North Holdings. Through a complex maze of corporate shells and legal proxies, I quietly purchased the distressed mortgage debt directly from the bank. I built an airtight legal firewall around the transaction. To this day, Douglas lives in that house, hosting lavish dinner parties, firmly believing that his own shrewd, aggressive negotiation tactics forced the bank to back down and restructure his loan. He has absolutely no idea that he is living in a property owned entirely by his daughter, and that I quietly pay the exorbitant property taxes every single quarter to keep up his grand illusion. I did not stop with my father. When Grant dropped out of his undergraduate arts program, claiming the curriculum was stifling his creative genius, I funded his first independent design studio. I paid the commercial rent for 2 entire years while he threw lavish parties and produced absolutely nothing of commercial value. When he was 22 years old, I quietly paid off $35,000 of high-interest credit card debt he had accumulated traveling across Europe to allegedly find inspiration. And when Lantern Acre Distilling, his current widely celebrated artisanal venture, faced a silent, completely unpublicized bankruptcy 3 years ago, I injected $80,000 of emergency seed capital just to keep the production vats running and the vendors from seizing his equipment. I bled myself dry for them. I sacrificed my youth, my academic dreams, and my personal peace to build a fortress of financial security around my family. But instead of gratitude, I received a rewritten history. Douglas could not handle the profound ego injury of being salvaged by a woman, especially his own daughter. He could not reconcile his image as a traditional, powerful patriarch with the reality that he was financially dependent on the child he used to ignore. So, over the years, he simply changed the narrative. The Ward family mythology was systematically altered. At country club dinners and social galas, Douglas would sigh dramatically and tell everyone that I lacked the discipline and the intellectual stamina for academia. He claimed I dropped out of the Whitley School of Business because I was too impatient, too hot-headed, and too obsessed with chasing dirty, fast money in the aggressive corporate sector. Meanwhile, Grant's endless string of expensive failures was completely reframed. Grant was the visionary. Grant was the misunderstood artist whose struggles were merely the necessary growing pains of a true creative entrepreneur. Douglas told the world that I was a cold, calculating machine, a dry accountant who did not understand the warmth of family or the true beauty of real life. He stood in the magnificent foyer of the townhouse I secretly owned, drinking the expensive craft whiskey from the company I secretly salvaged, and looked down on me with a mixture of pity and disdain. I became the bitter, solitary spinster sister, useful only for cutting checks when the true dreamers of the family temporarily stumbled. I had swallowed that bitter pill for years, accepting my role as the silent villain in their grand fictional play, but then Tessa Vale arrived. At first, I thought her behavior was just the natural curiosity of someone marrying into a wealthy circle, but as the months dragged on, the mask began to slip during our polite Sunday brunches and forced holiday dinners. Tessa did not ask about our childhood memories. She did not ask about family traditions. She asked, in her soft, practiced, perfectly modulated voice, about the corporate structure of Calder North Holdings. She casually inquired if my firm carried key person insurance on my life, asking what exactly would happen to the shares if the sole founder were suddenly incapacitated. She constantly brought up the concepts of wealth preservation and estate optimization. She talked enthusiastically about the tax benefits of consolidating all family assets into a singular marital trust after she and Grant tied the knot. She would corner me in the kitchen while pouring wine and ask highly specific, targeted questions about inheritance rights, generation-skipping trusts, and whether my assets were protected against future corporate litigation. I used to force myself to brush those moments off. I told myself she was just an ambitious woman working in luxury branding who naturally thought in terms of asset management. I lied to myself, desperately wanting to believe that my brother had simply found a sharp, modern partner. But sitting in my dark apartment, feeling the physical weight of the forged Holloway Bridge Capital loan agreement in my hands, the last remaining veil of denial was brutally ripped away. Tessa never wanted to be a sister-in-law. She never wanted to be a member of the family. She was a corporate raider looking at the Ward family as a distressed asset ready for a hostile takeover. She had mapped the entire financial flowchart. She saw that Grant and Douglas were financially hollow, completely dependent on my hidden infrastructure. She did not want to marry Grant to build a life with him. She wanted to step directly into the asset pipeline. She wanted to isolate the primary revenue generator, me, and legally reroute the dividends directly into her own pockets through marriage, consolidated trusts, and fraudulent loan guarantees. She thought I was just a tired, emotionally starved workaholic who would blindly sign anything to feel like a valued member of the family. She thought my desperate need for their love would override my professional instincts. She, just like my father and my brother, had severely underestimated the kind of monster you have to become to survive in the world of corporate loss recovery. They had spent years rewriting my history to make me look weak. Now, I was going to use their own arrogance to completely erase their future. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind my brother, any lingering trace of familial sorrow evaporated from my chest. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response to sudden loss or overwhelming grief, but I had not lost anything of actual value today. I had merely gained complete, unvarnished visibility into a hostile operation. The tired, recovering sister vanished, tirely, replaced by the chief executive officer of Harbor Trace Recovery Group. I walked back to the kitchen island, opened my encrypted laptop, and initiated a secure video conference protocol. I dialed Mara Kessler first. Mara is my personal attorney and the architect of my most aggressive corporate maneuvers. We had constructed the entire legal fortress of Calder North Holdings together years ago, burying my ownership of my father's estate behind layers of impenetrable corporate shielding. She is sharp, entirely devoid of sentimentality, and views the law not as a system of justice, but as a chessboard. While the call connected, I placed the forged commercial loan agreement onto my high-resolution flatbed scanner, digitizing every page with forensic clarity. Lydia. Mara's voice clipped through the speakers the second her face appeared on the screen. She was sitting in her downtown office, framed by walls of dense legal volumes. You are supposed to be on medical leave. If you are calling me about a corporate audit, I am hanging up. I am not calling about a client, I replied, my voice steady and cold. I just sent a heavily encrypted file to your secure inbox. It is a commercial credit application from Holloway Bridge Capital. Review the guarantor execution block on page 14. Mara's eyes darted off-screen to her secondary monitor. The silence stretched for exactly 2 minutes, broken only by the rapid clicking of her mouse. When she finally looked back at the camera, her expression had shifted from mild annoyance to sharp, predatory focus. This is your signature, Mara stated, though it was not a question. But the baseline alignment is digitally rigid. The ink saturation lacks standard pen pressure gradients. Someone lifted this from an old document and pasted it onto this execution line. It is a highly sophisticated composite. It is, I confirmed. My brother just hand-delivered it to my apartment under the guise of venue authorization forms for his wedding this weekend. He expects me to bring the physically signed packet to the rehearsal dinner tomorrow evening. This is not a family misunderstanding, Lydia, Mara said, leaning closer to the camera. This is a deliberate, premeditated act of severe civil forgery. If this document is submitted to Holloway Bridge Capital, it constitutes criminal wire fraud and bank fraud. I am perfectly aware, I said. Hold the line. I am bringing Ellis into the conference. I tapped the screen and dialed Ellis Van. Ellis is a financial forensic investigator who frequently contracts with my firm to dismantle complex corporate insurance fraud rings. He is a man who can track a single stolen dollar through a dozen offshore shell companies in his sleep. His video feed popped up a moment later. Boss, Ellis said, sipping from a massive ceramic mug. Tell me who we are hunting today. I need a comprehensive, expedited financial autopsy, I instructed, my tone shifting into pure operational command. Target 1 is Lantern Acre Distilling, owned by Grant Ward. Target 2 is Tessa Vale, operating as an independent luxury brand consultant. Target 3 is Douglas Ward. I need to know exactly where their cash flow is bleeding, and I need it in the next 4 hours. Give me the thread to pull, Ellis said, his fingers already flying across his keyboard. Look into a pending mezzanine debt facility at Holloway Bridge Capital, I directed. They are using my promised wedding gift of $100,000 as the primary collateral deposit to secure a much larger line of credit. I need to know the exact size of the crater they are trying to fill. I left the video bridge open, muting my microphone as I began to draft the preliminary cancellation notices on my own terminal. For the next 3 hours, my apartment felt like a corporate war room. The physical ache in my side faded entirely into the background, suppressed by a massive surge of pure, calculated adrenaline. I was no longer a victim waiting for the axe to fall. I was the executioner sharpening the blade. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Ellis unmuted his microphone. His face was grim, illuminated by the harsh light of a dozen spreadsheets open on his monitors. It is a bloodbath, Lydia, Ellis reported, shaking his head. Lantern Acre Distilling is not just taking on water, it is sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Grant has hundreds of barrels of aging inventory that he cannot move. He is severely delinquent on his primary glass supplier accounts, and he owes tens of thousands of dollars in back taxes. He needs a massive cash injection by the Tuesday following his honeymoon, or the entire operation defaults and his equipment gets seized by creditors. And the bridge loan from Holloway? Mara asked sharply. Holloway issued a preliminary approval yesterday, Ellis confirmed, but it is entirely contingent on Lydia acting as the secondary guarantor. They factored her net worth into the risk assessment. Without her signature on that specific execution block, the entire credit line collapses instantly. What about the bride? I asked, staring at the screen. What is Tessa hiding? Ellis let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Tessa Vale is a walking liability. Her boutique branding agency is currently embroiled in a sealed arbitration process with a former hospitality client. She blatantly misappropriated roughly $50,000 from a campaign budget to fund her own lifestyle expenses. The arbitrator ordered full restitution. She has 0 liquid assets left. She is desperately banking on Grant's new loan clearing next week, so she can quietly siphon off the capital to pay her legal penalties before she faces criminal embezzlement charges. I absorbed the information with absolute, terrifying clarity. They were not just reckless. They were actively drowning, and they had collectively decided to use my neck as a stepping stone to reach the surface. There is one more thing, Ellis added, his voice softening just a fraction. You asked me to run the financials on your father. That $5,000 monthly stipend you send him for property maintenance and medical deductibles? He has not paid a single contractor with it. He is dumping 70% of that allowance into high-risk, leveraged options trading, trying to chase quick returns, and consistently losing. The remaining 30% is going directly to his country club to cover his extravagant bar tabs and private dining fees to maintain his wealthy patriarch facade. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place. The complete, unadulterated truth of my family was laid out in columns of red ink and fraudulent contracts. All right, Mara interrupted, bringing the focus back to the immediate legal threat. Lydia, listen to me carefully. The wedding is in 48 hours. If Monday morning arrives, and that underwriter at Holloway processes the preliminary file, untangling your name from this fraudulent debt will require months of public litigation. To execute a safe, clean exit, you must unilaterally revoke every single financial string attached to this event before the disbursement window opens. I need to cancel the venue authorizations, I said, my mind already building the tactical checklist. I need to freeze the wire codes for the floral arrangements, the catering balances, and the audiovisual team, and I need to formally notify Holloway Bridge Capital that I decline any guarantor status. Exactly, Mara confirmed. But timing is everything. If you freeze the accounts right now, they will panic. They will scramble to find alternative, predatory funding, or they will completely cancel the wedding and blame you for ruining their lives. They will control the narrative. I am not going to let them control the narrative, I stated quietly, leaning back in my chair. I looked at the forged signature resting on my desk. I thought about the audio recording locked in my safe, featuring my father laughing as he instructed them to keep me smiling until the wire cleared. I thought about the decades of emotional manipulation, the rewritten history that painted me as a failure, and the sheer, breathtaking audacity of trying to steal my financial identity while I was recovering from surgery. I was not going to quietly cancel the checks from the safety of my office. I was not going to send a polite legal cease and desist letter. They had spent my entire life using my money to build a magnificent, brightly lit stage for themselves while keeping me hidden in the shadows. It was only fitting that I finally stepped out onto that exact same stage to burn it down. "Mara," I said, my voice cutting through the digital silence of the conference call. "Draft the revocation notices for every single vendor. Draft the official denial of credit authorization for Holloway Bridge Capital, but do not send them yet. Put everything on a delayed, encrypted send protocol." "When do you want the legal triggers pulled?" Mara asked, a faint trace of professional respect coloring her tone. "I will give you the exact hour tomorrow," I replied, a cold, calculated calm settling permanently into my bones. "I need to choose the perfect moment. I want the maximum amount of witnesses. I want the destruction of their financial facade to be public, irreversible, and entirely legal." I closed the laptop, cutting the connection. The apartment was silent again, but the suffocating weight of familial obligation was completely gone. I stood up, ignoring the faint twinge in my side, and walked toward my closet to select a tailored suit for the rehearsal dinner. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to show up, smile, and play my part perfectly, right up until the exact second the trap snapped shut. I walked into the Juniper Room at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The establishment is a highly exclusive, invite-only tasting lounge nestled deep within the historic financial district of Grayport. It is a place constructed entirely of dark mahogany, tufted leather wingback chairs, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of aged oak and expensive bourbon. Grant frequently uses this specific room to host prospective investors, treating the prestigious backdrop as a substitute for actual business acumen. Today, he had requested we meet here under the guise of finalizing the weekend itinerary over a light lunch. I did not arrive wearing the oversized, forgiving sweaters of a recovering surgical patient. I wore a sharply tailored, dark gray wool suit, a crisp white silk blouse, and a pair of polished leather heels. I had taken a very specific dose of pain medication an hour prior, perfectly calibrated to numb the burning sensation in my abdomen without dulling my cognitive reflexes. When I stepped through the frosted glass doors and approached their secluded corner booth, the visual impact was immediate. Grant and Tessa were already seated, leaning intimately over a small marble table. When they looked up and saw me, the relaxed, victorious smiles completely vanished from their faces. They had mentally prepared to handle a frail, exhausted woman easily molded by guilt. Instead, they were suddenly staring at the chief executive officer of Harbor Trace. "Lydia," Grant said, his voice faltering slightly as he hurriedly stood up to pull out a chair for me. "You look incredibly well. I thought you were strictly resting at home." "I found my second wind," I replied smoothly, taking my seat and declining the menu the waiter immediately offered. I ordered a simple glass of sparkling water with a twist of lemon. "It is amazing what a little clarity can do for the healing process." Tessa narrowed her perfectly lined eyes for a fraction of a second before her face melted back into that familiar, practiced mask of warm luxury. She reached across the table, her manicured fingers brushing the sleeve of my suit. "We are just so relieved you are feeling stronger. Darling, we really hated bothering you with all the chaotic administrative details yesterday." I let the waiter place my water on the table, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set the crystal glass down. I looked directly into my brother's eyes. Speaking of administrative details, Grant, I began, my voice pitched in a low, even tone that easily cut through the ambient jazz music playing in the lounge. I received an automated compliance email this morning. It was a standard congratulatory notice from the underwriting department at Holloway Bridge Capital, welcoming you to their lending portfolio. It also explicitly thanked me for my participation as your primary guarantor. Why would a commercial lender possess the impression that I am backing your corporate debt when I have never agreed to such a thing? The color drained out of Grant's face with a speed that would have been comical under different circumstances. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked exactly like a cornered animal. Before he could completely collapse, Tessa smoothly intervened. She did not flinch. She simply shifted her weight, commanding the space with the ease of a woman used to spinning corporate disasters into brilliant marketing narratives. "Oh, Lydia, please do not let an automated banking error stress you out." Tessa laughed, a light, musical sound that held absolutely no warmth. "It is just a matter of smart capital structuring. Between family members, these terms are incredibly fluid. Grant's broker was simply running preliminary models to see how the interest rates would adjust if we temporarily linked our financial profiles to secure the best possible terms for the distillery's expansion. There is absolutely nothing to be tense about." "Smart capital structuring," I repeated, letting the syllables roll around in my mouth as if tasting something deeply bitter. "Sss." "You submitted my financial profile to a high-yield credit fund without my consent simply to model an interest rate?" "It is just business modeling, Lydia," Tessa insisted, her tone growing a fraction firmer, patronizing me as if I were a confused intern. "Once the wedding is over and the accounts are merged, this strategic leverage is going to secure everything. It guarantees the new production facility, and frankly, it even secures the deposit on our honeymoon villa in the Mediterranean. We are also building a massive, immersive brand experience space for Lantern Acre. We just need the baseline capital to flow smoothly next week." She had slipped. In her desperate attempt to sound like a visionary, she had freely admitted the truth. The commercial loan was not just for distillery equipment. They were planning to use the fraudulent debt to fund their luxury vacation and vanity projects. They were going to spend my stolen credit rating on Mediterranean sunsets. Right on cue, a loud, booming voice shattered the tense atmosphere at the table. "Well, if it is not my three favorite people finalizing the grand event." Douglas Ward strode toward our booth, projecting the aura of a man who owned the entire building. He wore a camel hair overcoat and carried a crystal tumbler of scotch. His arrival was entirely too perfect, entirely too perfectly timed to be a coincidence. They had clearly orchestrated this. Douglas was the heavy artillery, called in to physically and verbally intimidate me if I started asking too many difficult questions. "Dad," Grant exhaled, his relief so palpable it was almost pathetic. "What a surprise. I just finished a lunch meeting next door and saw you all through the window." Douglas lied effortlessly, sliding into the leather booth beside Tessa. He took a sip of his scotch and fixed his gaze on me, his eyes hard and completely devoid of paternal affection. "I hope you are not in here interrogating your brother 2 days before his wedding. Lydia, you have a terrible habit of thinking like a dry auditor instead of acting like a supportive family member. Turn off the corporate brain for one weekend, will you?" "I am simply trying to understand the financial architecture of the weekend." "Douglas," I said, entirely dropping the title of father. He scoffed loudly, shaking his head. "There is nothing to understand except that your brother is stepping up to the plate, and you need to play your part without causing a scene. We are wards. We do not bicker over paperwork in public. You sign what needs to be signed. You smile for the cameras, and you support the family. It is not a negotiation." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply let my eyes drop to the marble table. Grant had placed his smartphone face up next to his water glass. When the screen illuminated with a new notification, the privacy settings failed to hide the content of his inbox. I could clearly read the subject line of the open email resting at the top of his screen. It was from the lead underwriter at Holloway. The text read, "Final disbursement schedule. Monday morning wire authorized pending final venue sign-off." They had already scheduled the theft. They had completely bypassed my consent, forged the documents, and set the timer for the Monday immediately following the wedding, assuming I would be too trapped by social convention to stop them. Beneath the table, entirely out of their line of sight, I held my own phone in my lap. I unlocked the screen using my thumbprint. I opened the encrypted messaging application linking directly to Mara Kessler. Keeping my face perfectly composed, maintaining a blank, attentive expression toward my father's lecturing, I typed out 2 short sentences without looking down. "Freeze everything. Notify lender no authorization." I tapped the send button. The digital command shot through the cellular network, instantly triggering the absolute destruction of their entire financial house of cards. Mara would execute the holds. The vendors would be locked out. Holloway Bridge Capital would immediately red flag Grant's account for suspected fraud. The silent guillotine had just dropped, and none of them sitting at the table had heard the blade fall. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a deep, steadying breath. I placed both hands firmly on the marble table and slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal jacket. I looked at the 3 of them. Douglas, radiating arrogant authority; Tessa, calculating and hungry; Grant, weak and complicit. "You are absolutely right, Douglas," I said, allowing a faint, perfectly polite smile to touch my lips. "Family is not a place for negotiation. I will see you all at the rehearsal dinner tonight. And I promise you, I will be at the wedding tomorrow exactly on time." I turned and walked out of the Juniper Room, leaving them completely secure in their arrogant belief that the trap they built for me was functioning perfectly. They had absolutely no idea that they were the ones locked inside the cage. The rehearsal dinner took place in the intimate coastal dining room of Belmere House. The space was illuminated entirely by hundreds of tall, flickering gold candles, casting long, dancing shadows against the dark, oak-paneled walls. Waiters in pristine white jackets moved silently between the tables, pouring exceptionally expensive vintage Bordeaux into crystal goblets. To anyone else, the atmosphere would have felt incredibly luxurious, a perfect celebration of high society romance and familial warmth. To me, the air felt thick, heavy, and utterly suffocating. It was a beautifully decorated trap. Every smile flashed in my direction. Every polite compliment from my father's wealthy friends felt like a heavily weighted transaction. Halfway through the main course, Douglas stood at the head of the main table and tapped a silver fork against his glass. The room fell into a reverent silence. He launched into a polished, theatrical speech, playing the role of the benevolent, successful patriarch to absolute perfection. He spoke of Grant's brilliant creative vision, painting him as the shining star of the Ward family legacy. He described Tessa as the missing piece to their perfect puzzle. Then, predictably, he turned his attention toward me. He did not praise my company. He did not mention my recent surgery or my recovery. Instead, he painted me as the peculiar, difficult daughter. He told the crowd I was our family's resident workhorse, a woman who preferred the cold comfort of a balance sheet over the warmth of a real life. The guests chuckled politely. He was systematically diminishing me in front of the room, framing me as an emotionally stunted financial machine so that my monetary contributions would seem like my only redeeming quality. I took a slow sip of my water, keeping my expression perfectly neutral, and analyzed my immediate surroundings. Tessa had personally designed the seating chart, and her tactical intentions were blindingly obvious. She had not placed me with the extended family or the childhood friends. I was seated at a small, circular table near the exit, flanked by 2 highly specific individuals. On my left sat the lead event coordinator for Belmere House. On my right was a man introduced earlier as a regional director for Holloway Bridge Capital. It was a physical pincer movement. Tessa wanted me boxed in by the exact people waiting for my signature, assuming the social pressure of sitting beside them would force my hand when she finally presented the forged documents. Between the salad course and the entree, The event coordinator leaned in close. I could smell the sharp peppermint on her breath, failing to mask the deep stress of managing a massively over-budget event. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She asked if I could verbally confirm the routing instructions for the imported floral archway and the last-minute premium seafood bar upgrades. She explicitly stated that several major vendors were threatening to pack up their equipment in the morning if the final ledgers were not balanced tonight. The sheer volume of unpaid invoices resting entirely on my shoulders was staggering. I offered her a polite, non-committal nod, assuring her that all outstanding balances would be addressed before the ceremony began. It was technically the truth. As dessert was being served, Grant abandoned his place of honor and sauntered over to my table. He held a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir, pouring a generous measure into my glass with a practiced, charming smile. He leaned against the back of my chair, playing the role of the devoted younger brother checking on his sibling. He asked if the noise was too much for my recovery. I assured him I was fine. Then, bolstered by the wine and his own inflated ego, he became entirely too comfortable. He leaned down and whispered that I would not have to worry about supporting him much longer. He casually mentioned that on Monday morning, right after he and Tessa boarded their flight for the honeymoon, he was going to publicly announce a massive new funding round for Lantern Acre Distilling. He called it a game-changing influx of institutional capital. He was so arrogant, so entirely blind to his own incompetence, that he was bragging to me about the very corporate debt he was currently attempting to steal using my forged signature. Grant wandered away, only to be immediately replaced by Tessa. She glided over in her elegant silk evening gown, a vision of bridal perfection. She placed a warm, entirely fake hand over mine. After a few minutes of hollow small talk about the table settings, she casually shifted the topic. She asked if I would mind doing her a tiny, seemingly insignificant favor. She requested that I forward my original email promising the $100,000 wedding gift to her new personal assistant. However, she specifically asked me to retype the body of the message using an older, more formal communication template we had used years ago regarding a family trust distribution. She claimed it was just for her meticulous wedding scrapbook, to keep the aesthetic of the family documents uniform. It was a pathetic, transparent lie. She desperately needed a digital paper trail that matched the exact font, spacing, and rhetorical style of the forged Holloway Bridge Capital Guarantor documents. The air in the room became too dense to breathe. I excused myself and walked out into the dimly lit, heavy oak corridor leading toward the venue lobbies. I needed a moment of absolute silence. I did not get one. Heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor behind me. I turned to see Douglas marching toward me, his face flushed with wine and suppressed rage. The jovial, beaming father from the banquet room was completely gone. He backed me toward the wall, invading my personal space, utilizing his physical size to intimidate me just as he had done when I was a teenager. He did not bother with pleasantries. He told me, his voice a low, venomous hiss, that he knew I was stalling on the final venue contracts. He warned me not to play games with him. He said if I dared to humiliate the family, if I caused even a single vendor to disrupt the ceremony tomorrow, he would destroy me. He promised that during his primary toast at the reception, he would take the microphone and tell every single wealthy, influential guest in the room the absolute worst version of my life. He threatened to announce that I was a bitter, selfish, deeply cynical woman who was entirely incapable of love. He would tell them I was not a complete woman, that I had no husband, no children, and nothing to offer the world except cold, hard currency. He promised to publicly brand me as an unnatural, jealous spinster trying to ruin her own brother's happiness out of pure spite. I stared up at the man who had sired me. I felt the dull, lingering ache of my surgical incisions, but my mind was sharper than a razor. In that isolated corridor, the defining strategy of my father's entire life was laid bare. He used public humiliation and the terror of social disgrace to control everything around him. He assumed the threat of being verbally eviscerated in front of our city's elite society would terrify me into submission. He believed I would quietly transfer the money and sign the fraudulent loan guarantees, just to avoid the unbearable shame of his public condemnation. He finished his threat, straightened his camel hair coat, and walked back into the dining room without looking back. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking crystal bleeding through the heavy wooden doors. I did not feel fear. I felt an absolute, unshakable conviction. Later that night, sitting in the quiet solitude of my hotel suite, I opened my encrypted terminal. I typed a highly specific set of instructions to my attorney, Mara Kessler. I authorized the immediate release of the vendor cancellation notices, the revocation of all financial backstops, and the formal legal denial of the Holloway Bridge capital credit application. But I added one final, crucial condition to the execution protocol. The digital trigger was not to be pulled in the morning. Every single legal and financial demolition order was scheduled to be transmitted at the exact, precise minute. My father stood up to deliver his grand toast at the wedding reception. He wanted to use the microphone as a weapon. I was going to let him pull the pin on his own grenade. The grand ballroom of Belmere House had been transformed into a grotesque, breathtaking monument to financial hemorrhage. Thousands of out-of-season white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, creating a dense canopy of forced luxury. 3 massive crystal chandeliers, rented at an exorbitant daily rate, cast a brilliant, fractured light over a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer silk gowns. A 12-piece live orchestra occupied a raised stage in the corner, playing sophisticated classical arrangements of modern pop songs. The premium open bar was fully stocked with top-tier spirits, including towering displays of Grant's artisanal whiskey, which were being poured generously by bartenders earning double their usual hourly rate. The guests mingling on the polished mahogany floor looked less like friends and family attending a wedding and more like the board of directors for a coastal private equity firm celebrating a ruthless corporate merger. It was a masterpiece of excess, funded entirely by a silent ledger they believed they could control forever. I arrived exactly 45 minutes after the ceremony had concluded on the coastal lawn. Skipping the vows and the tearful masquerade entirely, I did not wear the soft, pastel chiffon bridesmaid dress that Tessa had passive-aggressively ordered for me months ago. Instead, I wore a sharply tailored, floor-length black crepe gown with a structured, architectural blazer draped over my shoulders. It was the armor of an executive, not the attire of a compliant sister. I stood near the heavy brass double doors at the very back of the ballroom, a solitary, dark shadow against the blinding white decor. I leaned slightly against the cool wall, managing the dull, rhythmic ache of my surgical incisions with slow, measured breaths. I was completely detached from the theatrical performance unfolding in front of me, watching them celebrate their supposed victory with the cold, clinical eye of an auditor observing a failing asset. The orchestra abruptly silenced as the maitre d' chimed a crystal glass. The crowd instinctively parted, forming a wide, expectant semicircle around the polished center of the dance floor. Douglas strode out into the middle of the room, bathing in the warm, perfectly angled spotlight. He held a sleek cordless microphone in his right hand and a tall flute of vintage champagne in his left. He looked magnificent, every inch the wealthy, established patriarch he desperately pretended to be. He began his speech with the practiced, booming cadence of a seasoned politician. He spoke grandly about the Ward family legacy, painting Grant as a brilliant, trailblazing visionary who was taking the artisanal spirits industry by storm through sheer willpower and creative genius. He called Tessa a radiant, flawless addition to our lineage, the perfect, supportive partner to stand beside a young business titan. The crowd applauded warmly, swallowing the fictional narrative without a single question. Then, as he paused to let the applause wash over him and take a sip of his champagne, his eyes scanned the crowd. He looked over the heads of the wealthy investors and country club members, locking his gaze directly onto me standing in the shadows at the back of the room. A cruel, familiar smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. He adjusted his grip on the microphone and deliberately pivoted the narrative. "And of course, we must acknowledge my eldest daughter, Lydia," Douglas boomed, his voice echoing sharply off the vaulted ceilings. The spotlight operator, sensing the shift, swung a secondary beam of light to illuminate my position by the doors. Hundreds of heads turned to look at me. Lydia, who is always working, always calculating the margins, he began to pace the floor, playing to his audience. She abandoned her Master of Business Administration degree years ago to chase the corporate grind, and she has not stopped running since. She is a woman who lives entirely inside her spreadsheets. She does not have a husband to dance with tonight. She does not have the time to learn how to live softly or gracefully, like a normal woman. He let out a loud, booming chuckle, raising his glass slightly higher, leaning into the microphone to ensure every single syllable carried maximum weight. But, ladies and gentlemen, we love her anyway, because at the end of the day, at least her money is useful. A wave of laughter rippled through the massive ballroom. It was a complex, ugly sound. Some guests chuckled nervously out of sheer awkward politeness, unsure how to process the sudden hostility. Others, the ones who fed on social cruelty and country club gossip, laughed with genuine, open malice. A few simply assumed it was a standard, tasteless joke traded among the ultra-wealthy, a bit of eccentric family banter. Douglas stood there, soaking in the laughter, firmly believing he had just successfully executed his ultimate threat. He thought the public humiliation would pin me to the wall, forcing me to quietly sign the forged loan documents to buy back my dignity. He thought I would shrink. I did not flinch. I did not lower my eyes to the floor. I pushed off the heavy wooden doorframe, squared my shoulders, and began to walk. My black leather heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood, a sharp, metallic, predatory sound that rapidly cut through the fading laughter. The crowd sensed the sudden, violent shift in the atmospheric pressure. The smiles vanished from the faces of the guests nearest to me. They instinctively stepped back, parting like the sea, clearing a direct, unobstructed path down the center of the room. I walked straight up to my father. The smug, victorious satisfaction on his face faltered for a fraction of a second as I stepped aggressively into his spotlight. He opened his mouth, perhaps to deliver another patronizing joke, but I did not give him the oxygen. Before he could utter another syllable or pull his arm away, I reached out and clamped my hand over his. I looked directly into his eyes, letting him see the absolute, sub-zero void where my daughterly affection used to reside, and I pulled the microphone straight out of his grip. The physical transition was so smooth, so entirely devoid of hesitation, that his fingers simply went slack. I turned my back to him, completely dismissing his existence, and faced the hundreds of wealthy guests. The massive ballroom instantly fell into a suffocating, leaden silence. The ambient noise died completely. You could hear the faint crackle of the audio system. You could hear the ice melting in the cocktail glasses. I raised the microphone to my lips. I did not yell. I did not let a single tremor of emotion bleed into my voice. I spoke with the terrifying, absolute calm of a corporate executioner. "Dad, you are absolutely right," I said, my voice projecting crisp, cold, and clear through the massive speaker system, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "If all I'm useful for is my money, then the money ends tonight. The $100,000 gift is canceled." A collective, audible gasp swept through the front rows, but I did not pause to let them recover. I stepped fully into the center of the dance floor, addressing the entire room, specifically locking eyes with the vendors hovering near the exits and the financial contacts Tessa had so carefully seated at the prime tables. "Furthermore," I continued, my tone shifting into the undeniable, crushing authority of a chief executive officer tearing up a contract, "every single financial guarantee, every vendor payment code, every line of credit backstop limit, and every banking confirmation bearing my name has been legally revoked within the last 2 hours. The capital has been completely and permanently withdrawn from this event and all associated corporate ventures. Let me be perfectly clear to anyone in this room currently conducting business with my family. I am not a guarantor for Lantern Acre Distilling. Any commercial loan documents, bridge credit applications, or asset confirmations currently circulating that utilize my name or my copied signature are completely fraudulent." The grand illusion shattered with the force of a physical explosion. Tessa bolted upright from her chair at the head table so fast she knocked her crystal water goblet onto the floor. It shattered into dozens of pieces, mirroring the violent destruction of her plans. Her face twisted into a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic, completely abandoning her carefully crafted, soft, bridal elegance. Grant remained absolutely frozen in his seat, his jaw slack, his face drained of all color. His eyes were wide with the sudden, paralyzing realization that he was standing at the edge of a cliff and I had just pushed him over. Behind me, Douglas turned the color of old ash. The vintage champagne flute trembled so violently in his hand that the pale liquid spilled over the rim, staining his immaculate tuxedo jacket, but the most beautiful, telling reaction did not come from my terrified family. In the second row of tables, sitting exactly where Tessa had meticulously placed him to pressure me, the regional director from Holloway Bridge Capital did not look at the frantic bride or the paralyzed groom. He did not gasp. He quietly set his linen napkin down, reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored navy suit, pulled out his smartphone, and immediately began typing a rapid, urgent message. His face was set in grim, professional alarm. That tiny, glowing screen in the dimly lit ballroom was the undeniable signal. The theatrical performance was officially over. The trap had snapped shut, breaking their bones in the process, and the brutal, real-world consequences had just arrived. I handed the cordless microphone to a completely stunned waiter standing near the edge of the dance floor and stepped off the polished mahogany wood. The silence in the massive ballroom did not break into chaotic shouting or dramatic cinematic gasps. Instead, it crystallized instantly into a hyper-professional, terrifyingly quiet crisis. True corporate vengeance does not arrive with screaming matches or thrown glassware. It arrives via encrypted emails, automated banking alerts, and breached contractual clauses. Within 60 seconds of my public announcement, the senior operations manager of Belmere House materialized beside the head table. Her previously warm, deferential demeanor had entirely vanished, replaced by the rigid, unyielding posture of a corporate creditor. She carried a sleek digital tablet, tapping the illuminated screen to display a cascading list of red financial alerts to the bride and groom. She informed them, her voice carrying an icy, unwavering politeness that carried perfectly in the quiet room, that the credit holds on their primary accounts had just bounced. The imported seafood stations, the extended hours for the live orchestra, the premium open bar, and the luxury valet service were no longer secured by a verified financial backstop. She requested an immediate alternative form of payment, specifically a direct wire transfer from an authorized account, or her staff would begin dismantling the service stations and pulling the plates from the tables in exactly 15 minutes. At that exact same moment, sitting in the second row of tables, the regional director from the Commercial Credit Fund stood up. His smartphone was firmly pressed to his ear. I watched him listen intently for a few brief seconds, presumably receiving the automated compliance alerts triggered by my attorney regarding the fraudulent application. He gave a sharp, definitive nod, slipped his phone into his tailored jacket, and began packing his leather briefcase. He walked directly toward the exit, his face an impenetrable mask of risk management, without offering a single word of congratulations to the couple. The preliminary approval for the mezzanine debt facility was officially dead. The bridge loan was permanently frozen. The reality of her completely ruined financial pipeline finally slammed into Tessa. The sophisticated, untouchable luxury branding expert vanished right before our eyes. She launched herself out of her chair, her face contorted into an ugly, desperate mask of sheer panic. She completely lost control of her carefully curated image, shrieking at the venue manager, demanding they respect the occasion and accusing the staff of gross incompetence. Her voice cracked wildly, echoing harshly over the remaining, stunned attendees. It was a spectacular, unhinged loss of social control. Around the room, the affluent guests did not look away in polite, wealthy embarrassment. They leaned in. I saw dozens of smartphones discreetly raised from the tables. High-definition camera lenses focused directly on the screaming bride in her ruined white gown. The social currency they valued so highly was completely evaporating in real time, recorded and destined to be disseminated across their exclusive networks by midnight. Before I could reach the heavy brass doors to exit the ballroom, a hand clamped down hard on my bicep. Douglas spun me around, attempting to drag me into a secluded, shadowed alcove near the coat check. His face was a mottled, unhealthy purple, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He leaned in close, his voice a frantic, venomous hiss, ordering me to stop destroying our family in front of the entire world. He demanded I call my legal team immediately, reverse the vendor holds, and fix the situation to save his reputation. I looked down at his trembling hand gripping my jacket, then back up into his terrified, desperate eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply stated a plain, undeniable fact. I reminded him that I had explicitly warned him in the hallway outside the rehearsal dinner. I reminded him that he was the one who demanded the spotlight, and he was the exact person who chose to use this public stage as a weapon. I was merely delivering the performance he had so arrogantly requested. I pulled my arm completely free from his weak grasp and walked out into the cool, dark coastal air, leaving the reception to collapse under its own fraudulent weight. As my private car drove me back to the city limits, my phone began to vibrate relentlessly, filling up with frantic, fragmented audio messages from my brother. Grant was finally seeing the entire, unvarnished picture of his own ruin. For months, he had been living inside a comfortable, insulated delusion, believing his artisanal brand was simply experiencing a minor temporary cash flow issue. Now, forced to confront the ruthless venue managers and the angry vendors without my checkbook acting as a permanent shield, the sheer, staggering magnitude of his debts became undeniably real. He confessed in his second breathless voicemail that the extravagant Mediterranean honeymoon, the immersive brand experience space, the comprehensive new marketing packages, and every single wedding upgrade were entirely dependent on the assumption that I would be forced into signing the guarantor paperwork. Without the bridge loan from the credit fund, he could not even pay the balance for the bridal suite they were supposed to sleep in that very night. The revelations grew much darker by 3 o'clock in the morning. A third voicemail arrived, Grant's voice trembling with a mixture of profound betrayal and absolute panic. In the chaotic aftermath of the ruined reception, while frantically searching through Tessa's luggage for a secondary credit card to appease the venue staff, he had discovered a hidden manila folder. It contained a legally drafted post-nuptial addendum, meticulously prepared by Tessa's private attorneys. The document was designed to be signed the moment they returned from their Mediterranean trip. It explicitly outlined a legal framework to shift the entirety of her massive, previously undisclosed arbitration debts and restitution penalties directly into their newly formed joint financial structure. She had never planned to share in his visionary success. She had meticulously planned to legally bind him to her own financial ruin. In his blind panic, Grant had confronted our father in the hotel lobby, only to unearth an even deeper layer of betrayal. Douglas, backed into a corner by his son's screaming accusations, confessed the secret side deal he had brokered prior to the wedding. He admitted he had privately promised Tessa a significant, formalized voting block within the supposed family trust and a direct say in all future asset allocations. The price for her seat at the table was her strategic assistance in permanently pushing me out of the long-term financial decision-making process. They had formed a unified, predatory alliance to bleed me dry, only to turn around and actively conspire against one another the moment my capital was removed from the equation. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the corporate fallout hit them with the precision of a synchronized military strike. I sat in my quiet penthouse, sipping black coffee, listening to the final, devastating operational update from my forensic investigator. The news of the frozen commercial credit had leaked instantly through the financial district. Small angel investors who had previously backed the artisanal distillery began calling Grant's business line relentlessly, demanding immediate emergency audits of his operating capital. The primary equipment suppliers, the ones holding the leases on his massive copper stills, officially triggered the default clauses in their contracts, citing a severe, irreparable breach of his payment schedules. The grand illusion was completely, irrevocably dead. Grant Ward was sitting in a cheap, standard hotel room near the airport, his phone buzzing endlessly with collection threats and legal notices. As the morning light crept through the blinds, he was entirely unsure if he had just married a life partner or if he had merely signed himself onto a rapidly sinking, catastrophic liability dressed up in white silk and beautiful, expensive floral arrangements. Exactly 10 days after the spectacular collapse of the wedding reception, my father made his final, desperate attempt to reclaim his lost power. He could not accept that the silent machinery of his life had permanently shut down. In a move of staggering arrogance, Douglas filed an emergency civil injunction against me. His attorneys drafted a ridiculous petition claiming detrimental reliance, demanding that I legally fulfill my verbal promise of the $100,000 wedding gift and accusing me of causing intentional reputational damage to the Ward family name. He forced all of us into a mandatory, closed-door dispute resolution session, firmly believing he could use the intimidation of a formal legal setting to bully me back into submission. We convened in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at a neutral arbitration firm in the center of the financial district. Douglas sat on one side of the long mahogany table, flanked by Grant and Tessa. Tessa looked pale and deeply exhausted, her designer facade cracking under the weight of her looming personal insolvency. Grant simply looked hollow. I walked into the room accompanied only by Mara Kessler. I did not come to argue. I did not come to trade emotional insults. I came to permanently close the ledger using the only language they could no longer manipulate: facts, timelines, and irrefutable documentation. The mediator, a retired circuit judge, read the preliminary claims. Douglas immediately launched into a rehearsed narrative of paternal betrayal, painting himself as the victim of a cruel, capricious daughter who had maliciously ruined the most important day of her brother's life. He demanded the immediate release of the funds, arguing that the social contracts of family were binding. I did not raise my voice to interrupt him. I simply looked at Mara, who unclasped a thick black leather binder. Mara did not address the mediator. She looked directly at Douglas's legal counsel. She began laying out a meticulously organized sequence of printed emails, digital forensic reports, and blown-up visual aids. She presented the metadata extracted from the Holloway Bridge Capital Credit application. She showed the exact Internet Protocol addresses and the precise timestamps indicating when the document was altered. Then, she placed a high-resolution, side-by-side comparison of the signature on page 14 next to a proxy form from 3 years ago. "What you are looking at is not a family misunderstanding," Mara stated, her voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice. "It is a digitized, pixel-perfect replication of my client's signature, executed without her consent, to secure commercial debt. It is a textbook example of severe civil forgery and attempted bank fraud." Douglas's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly realizing his client had lied to him about the nature of the dispute. Douglas, however, tried to bluster his way through it. He slammed his hand on the table, claiming the documents were just draft proposals and that I was intentionally taking family business out of context to avoid paying my fair share. I reached into my briefcase and placed a small, sleek digital audio player onto the center of the mahogany table. I pressed the play button. The raw, unedited audio from the rehearsal dinner echoed through the silent conference room. Every single person at the table heard my father's booming, distorted laugh. They heard Tessa calmly discussing how to bury the guarantor clauses on page 7, and they heard the undeniable, damning instruction from my father's own mouth. "Only her money is useful. If Lydia shows up, smile at her until the wire clears." The recording clicked off. The absolute silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Every single moral defense, every claim of family loyalty, and every ounce of my father's fabricated patriarchal dignity instantly evaporated. He sat frozen in his expensive chair, staring at the small black device as if it were a live explosive. "But that is not the reason we are here today," I said softly, leaning forward and lacing my fingers together. I shifted my gaze away from my father and looked directly at my brother. The forgery and the insults are in the past. We need to talk about the future of Lantern Acre Distilling. Grant swallowed hard, refusing to meet my eyes. 72 hours ago, I continued, my voice perfectly level. My private holding company, Calder North Holdings, initiated a quiet corporate acquisition. I bought the distressed, primary commercial debt attached to your distillation equipment directly from your suppliers. I paid pennies on the dollar because you were in catastrophic default. Grant's head snapped up. Tessa physically recoiled in her chair, her eyes widening in sheer terror. That means I am no longer just your sister. I told him. I am your primary secured creditor. I legally own the copper stills. I own the aging barrels. If I file the paperwork currently sitting in Mara's briefcase, I can seize your entire physical operation by 5 o'clock this afternoon and liquidate your brand to recoup my investment. Grant looked like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. He opened his mouth to beg, but I held up a single hand to stop him. I am not going to crush you, Grant, I said quietly, but I am offering you a singular, non-negotiable choice. You will publicly cooperate with my legal team to permanently correct all fraudulent financial records. You will sign a legally binding separation of liabilities, ensuring Tessa's prior arbitration debts never touch any corporate structure bearing the Ward name. You will drop the luxury brand ambassador facade, sell the expensive loft, and you will learn how to actually run a business from the ground up, under the strict oversight of an independent financial controller that I appoint. I looked at Tessa. Or you can walk out of here together. I will seize the assets tomorrow morning, and you two can figure out how to pay off her embezzlement penalties with zero income. The choice was a surgical strike. It stripped away the illusion and demanded actual accountability. Tessa stared at me, then looked at Grant. She saw the absolute defeat in his posture. She realized with terrifying clarity that the infinite well of Ward family money had just been capped with solid concrete. There was no honeymoon villa. There was no brand experience center. There was only a mountain of debt and a brother who was no longer a useful puppet. Tessa stood up. She did not say a word to Grant. She did not offer a tearful apology or a defiant speech. She simply picked up her designer handbag, turned on her heel, and walked out of the arbitration room. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, fracturing their marriage before the ink on the wedding certificate had even dried. Douglas, realizing he had absolutely zero leverage left, quietly instructed his attorney to withdraw the emergency petition. If he pursued the matter any further, Mara would hand the forgery file directly to the district attorney, and the resulting criminal investigation would completely obliterate the high society reputation he valued more than his own children. He signed the withdrawal papers in total silence, stood up, and left the room without looking at me. That afternoon, I logged into my secure banking portal. I did not keep the $100,000 for myself. I executed a direct wire transfer, sending the exact amount to the Marion Ward Skilled Trades Fund. It is an endowment I quietly established years ago, named after my late mother. The fund provides comprehensive financial grants to young women who are forced to abandon their higher education because of sudden family crises. It was a beautiful, profoundly painful closure. I did not hoard the wealth, but I ensured that my family would never be able to touch a single cent of it again. 6 weeks later, the heavy oak door of my penthouse chimed. When I opened it, Grant was standing in the hallway. He was not wearing a tailored blazer or an expensive watch. He wore a faded canvas work jacket and jeans that smelled faintly of yeast and industrial cleaning supplies. He looked tired, older, but surprisingly grounded. He did not ask for a loan. He did not ask me to fix a vendor dispute. He held up a thick, spiral-bound notebook filled with handwritten inventory logs and projected realistic production schedules. He asked if I had an hour to review his actual numbers. I looked at my younger brother. I had not fully forgiven him. The scars from that week would take years to fade, and the fundamental trust between us was permanently altered. But as I stepped back and pulled the door open to let him inside, I finally felt a sense of absolute peace. For the very first time in my life, I was allowing him into my home not as a silent ATM, but as a sister with an unbreakable boundary. The sister was still there, willing to guide him, but the wallet was closed forever. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and do not forget to hit the hype button so this story can reach and be heard by many more people.